I'm joined today by Emma Cameron, an ESG analyst at Legal and General Investment Management America, to discuss the issue of diversity in emerging markets. Welcome, Emma.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. Great to do to talk today. This is an interesting topic, and you've been quite pioneers in this area. Can I start by asking why you moved into emerging markets to drive the diversity debate?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So the topic of diversity is one that LGIM and the investment stewardship team at LGIM really cares a lot about and has been looking at for well over a decade now. So we really wanted to focus on emerging markets for a few reasons. One of the reasons is because there just appears to be way less global investor focus in the emerging market space. So many companies that we actually have met with have said that we are the first or one of the first few investors to reach out to discuss this topic of diversity. Another reason has to do with gaps in the data. So we receive pretty comprehensive data from our standard data providers in terms of diversity data in the US and the UK and developed markets, but there's way less coverage in emerging markets. And this might be because of different disclosure standards in emerging markets, or maybe even having it be illegal in certain places to ask for certain aspects of diversity data. So this is something we wanted to explore. And then finally, we have this theory that there's different challenges across markets, across countries, in emerging markets, and that these challenges and topics that matter to organizations are really going to vary on a country by country basis. So because of these reasons, we really thought this was a good basis to kind of start to expand and globalize our approach to diversity.
How has the response been?
Yeah, so just to provide a bit more context, so what we did was we selected 4 key emerging markets that we wanted to engage with, and we sent letters to the chair of the board at the 10 largest companies in each of these markets, asking to engage on the topic of diversity. And the reason we selected the largest companies is because we believe that the largest companies have stand to make the greatest impact in this space and are leaders on this topic. So the response from that has been varied, but overall, we have met with around half of these companies. So overall, we sent 40 letters out, and around half of these companies we've actually had meetings with and had really engaging discussions with. And so the response based on country has been varied, but of the ones that have answered and we've engaged with, overall, they've been really transparent, really eager to talk with us, really eager to share all of the progress and efforts that they've been making in terms of diversity on an organizational level. So yeah, it's been really encouraging to see such a great response rate from these organizations and really eager to engage with us.
Okay, so can you give me a bit more insight in terms of the meetings you've held then? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so some insights that we've gained from these meetings. I'd say the first one is really just that the priority of diversity appears to differ quite drastically from on a country by country basis. So for example, I mentioned that the response rate kind of varied. So with South Africa and Brazil, we met with those, that was where the bulk of our meetings were. They were really eager to engage with us, really high response rates, brought board executives onto the meetings, which shows us that that's like really a high priority for them. Prepared meeting decks specifically for our call. So that signals to us that they take diversity really seriously, that it's a really big priority for them. Whereas some other countries like India and China, the response rate was really low. We only had 1 to 2 meetings with companies in each of these markets. So that just kind of signals to us that the diversity conversation it's just at a different stage right now. So that's kind of the first takeaway, I'd say, is just around, seeing how the priority of diversity really varies on a country by country basis. Secondly, I'd say that the topics and different concerns that come up in these conversations will also be really market dependent. So for South Africa, particularly, this concept of brain drain came up a lot. So the concept of top diverse talent being recruited away from their market to other markets, whether it be for economic reasons, social reasons, et cetera. But that came up as a big, topic of concern. Another topic that kind of varied depending on the market is around physical safety, sexual assault, sexual harassment. So that was a big one in South Africa and also in Brazil. And then another thing that we noticed is like regional differences, even within these countries. So for example, in Brazil, the focus on racial and ethnic diversity would differ really drastically depending on where in the country the company is operating. So if you're in the north, there's more of there might be more of a focus on ethnic diversity because of the population, versus in the south where there's less ethnic diversity in the population. Similarly to that, in India, just looking at women in the workforce, it differs really drastically across the country as well. More rural areas, there's way less women even participating in the workforce versus, larger cities. So these are just some of the ways that different topics can come up, and different concerns within a market, and even, on a regional basis within that country.
Wow, that's a wide range of approaches then that you need to take in these markets, presumably.
Yeah, it seems like the big takeaway is that there's no one size fits all approach to diversity, and there's so many cultural differences and cultural sensitivities and potential barriers to approaching and even talking about and addressing diversity in a lot of these markets.
Right. Wow. Fascinating. So, in terms of what are the drivers then, driving diversity in emerging markets? Is it via regulation, via individuals, or organizations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, the answer is that it really varies depending on the market. So I'll just give a few examples. So in South Africa, for example, they are very regulatory driven. There is a lot of policy in place. They have a very strong corporate governance code. They have the broad-based Black economic empowerment regulation, which is around, advancing economic transformation, and enhancing the economic participation of Black people in the South African economy. So they have a lot of these different, regulations and policies in place that are kind of making the bar a little bit higher for that country. Brazil, on the other hand, it's really seems to be company driven, organizational driven. So there's a lot of investor groups. There's a lot of industry initiatives. And it seems like a lot of the diversity efforts come from within a specific organization because they decide that matters to them and to their corporate culture. But they do, an interesting thing that came up with Brazil is that they actually do have one quota around diversity at the regulatory level that has to do with disabilities. So there's actually a quota, depending on the size of the company, between 2 to 5% of the employee base has to be people with disabilities. So it's interesting to just see how, regulatory landscape can even differ so drastically between, what the focus is, what aspect of diversity. And then in India, for example, there is a legal requirement. There has to be one woman on the board. But, board diversity from a gender perspective is still really low. So it kind of goes to show like these targets and policies are essential for kind of like setting the minimum standard, but there needs to be so much more to go above and beyond to actually create these inclusive and diverse environments within corporate culture.
Yeah. So regulation can only go so far then, really, can it?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely helps to move the conversation forward. Something I didn't mention is, like proxy advisory firms also can have a lot of influence on a certain market. So that's something that came up within Brazil, that ISS, a proxy firm, they kind of set a lot of things in motion in terms of diversity standards. So there's a lot of different levers at play. So it's hard to pinpoint, what, if there's one specific thing that drives diversity. It's kind of the combination of, regulation, organizations taking it upon themselves to really prioritize this as a key, strategy for them. And then, yeah, with industry groups and other kind of coalitions of people coming together to set targets and set goals.
Okay. So what would you say have been the biggest challenges you've faced? Because it sounds like you've got in there at the coalface. So what have been the biggest challenges you've faced in that?
Yeah, the biggest challenges I think have just been around time zone coordination, honestly. So like I'm located in Chicago. Our colleagues that are also working on this campaign are located in London. So that's
Yeah.
already a time difference. And then, with adding in India and China and South
Okay.
Africa, it's I think that's definitely just been one of the biggest challenges. It's a minor challenge. It's not
Yeah.
anything we can't overcome, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of actually dealing with people and organisations, you haven't faced cultural pushback or anything like that.
Mm. So I think so we kind of cherry picked the companies that we were going to talk with, So we picked the largest companies in these markets based on market cap. So these are large, mostly global companies. So the ones that did respond to us and the ones that did actually want to engage with us did so because they wanted to showcase what they've been doing. They wanted to be like, hey, we're a leader in the space and we're really excited to share this with you. So for the meetings that we have had, it's been like I said earlier, everyone's been really, for the most part, transparent and just eager to share what they've been doing. The conversation can, depending on where a certain company is in the diversity journey within their organization, that could have a bit of an impact on the conversation. So like some conversations might be solely focused on gender diversity, like they're the scope of diversity that they're looking at hasn't really broadened out beyond that. Whereas other companies might be not only looking at gender, but also all of the facets of diversity and how to change the actual corporate culture to make it inclusive for those diverse candidates. So yeah, it's not necessarily a challenge, but just kind of interesting to see the spectrum of where different corporations, where these large leaders, large corporations that are leaders in their markets, how even that small subset of 10 companies in a market can really differ in their thinking and in their progress on diversity.
Oh, brilliant. That's fascinating. What then do you see as the biggest obstacles with diversity in emerging markets going forward?
Yeah, so I think the biggest obstacle is around retention of diverse talent and inclusion of diverse talent. Like we kind of touched on earlier, like targets and compliance with those targets is really important to help get diverse talent in the door. But the conversation really needs to be shifting towards how do we retain this diverse talent? How do we create cultures that are inclusive? How do we help these diverse employees feel like their voice matters, help them feel like they're included, help them to progress their careers forward? How do we ensure that they're being paid on an equal level as their male counterparts? So I think the biggest obstacle is really just, yeah, how do we tackle that aspect of diversity? And I think it's not just an issue within emerging markets, it's a global issue. I think it's present in the US and the UK, wherever you go. It's, it's one thing to just find diverse talent and hire them. And it's another thing to actually shift the corporate culture in a way that is supportive of diverse talent and inclusive. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And then outside of that, just, it's become apparent through this conversation, there's no one size fits all approach to diversity. So I think there's always going to be, cultural differences and potential barriers that can come up when approaching diversity. So that's just something to keep in mind as well.
Brilliant. Turning it around a little bit, is there anything the developed world can learn from emerging markets on this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's become really apparent through these conversations that we can all learn from each other on this. We're all kind of in the same boat, like globally, trying to just move this conversation around diversity and why it's so important forward. So I'll give a couple tangible examples. Like, so for example, in South Africa, it is companies are required to share specific diversity data on their organization up to the Department of Labor. And this is kind of similar to what the US does with EEO1 data, which is equal employment opportunity data. So companies in the US that have over 100 employees have to report gender and racial diversity data. And the only difference is that in South Africa, the Department of Labor actually takes all of the data from the companies, aggregates it, and then shares it with the public. So whereas in the US, the EEO1 data just kind of goes, no one sees it. Like, unless you publish it on your own, there's really it's not required that companies publish this. So that was something that definitely stood out to us as like an interesting learning of how that could be really useful to see on a corporate level in a country, like what the diversity demographics are, and how that's changing over time, and then how that compares to the overall population. Because if you're just looking at, companies that are submitting this data, that's a real, but you can get a really good sense of how corporate culture is improving upon diversity when you compare that to the broader population. So that was one really interesting example that came up that we were like, wow, that's really cool. And then the other piece that I wanted to mention was, and I think I touched on this briefly earlier, but just around how Brazil has a quota around hiring people with disabilities of up to 5%. And that is really that really says a lot. Like, it says that people with disabilities are a protected minority, and it's really a priority for them to be including people with disabilities into the workforce, and not just including them, but it's also helping them to get the appropriate training that they need for the job. So, and that, people with disabilities, it doesn't seem to be as large of a focus in, the US and UK conversations that we have around diversity. So yeah, just there's a few different interesting angles that I think we've learned about diversity from these conversations.
Brilliant. That's fascinating. Any other observations on diversity in emerging markets you would like to share, Emma?
I think, yeah, I mean, that we have a lot of insights and takeaways. We're actually in the process right now, we being the LGIM stewardship team that's working on this campaign, and we're in the process of kind of collating all of our ideas and takeaways and best practices from our conversations that we've had with these companies, and putting it into a type of thought piece. So if you're interested, be on the lookout for that. There will definitely be more details, more market specific takeaways in that. So we're excited to get that moving forward.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Thank you very much. Well, so thank you very much for your time, Emma. That's been fascinating. And thank you very much for watching as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.